But first of all, I want to go back and do a little bit of review in case you might have forgotten what we talked about last week, or somebody came in for this week who wasn't here last week. Last week we talked a little bit about the qualifications for elders, that is what we would call pastors today, and how they are to be upstanding in every way. They're supposed to be able to lead their families well. They're supposed to be able to be theologically and doctrinally sound, because how they're supposed to lead their church and how they have to confront heresies within the community. And we also talked about how the lives of the Christians in the church at Crete, that's the island where Titus was ministering and where Paul was writing this letter to, their lives should be in stark contrast to the lives of the people surrounding them. In other words, their lives were supposed to be a witness to the Christian faith. We talked a little bit about the heresy that Paul was confronting and that Titus was confronting, and how it was this odd mix of Gnosticism and Judaism, and how that had kind of infiltrated the church and was causing all sorts of problems for Titus. And then Paul concluded the first section of this letter, the end of chapter 1, by saying that the heretics were unfit and not to be trusted. Let me read that last part for you, and we're going to tie it right in with chapter 2. They profess to know God, but they deny Him by their works. They are detestable, disobedient, unfit for any good works. As I was preparing for this, I kind of tried to think of a theme to tie this entire section together. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 10. And my mind, oddly enough, kept going back to a commercial from when I was a kid. This was probably from the mid-90s. And it stands out in my mind because when I was 11, 12, 13 years old, I really wanted to get a Dodge truck. And so whenever the Dodge commercials would come on TV, I watched them and paid attention to them. And the commercial, the tagline was Dodge, different. And usually in the commercial it would have a whole bunch of things of one type. I remember one of them had like a whole bunch of black birds. And then all of a sudden, here comes this red bird. And it was supposed to be the Dodges were different and cool. And so I started reading through this, and everything in this passage points to Christians being different and standing out from the rest of the culture. So keep that in your mind as we go through this. Now, the other thing that I want to say by way of introduction is we're jumping into chapter 2 here. And sometimes when we read books of the Bible, when we study the Bible, we divide it up into chapters. We say, all right, I'm going to read a chapter of Galatians today, and that's going to be my Bible study. Well, that's great. It's incredibly useful that our Bible is divided up into chapters and verses. But what we need to remember is that when these were written, there were no chapters and verses. They weren't divided up like that. They were added in later by scribes and scholars in order to make reading and referencing easier. And so these chapters and verses, while helpful, are not authoritative, as it were. And chapter 2 and chapter 1 of Titus are very closely linked together. And if you somehow separate those in your mind, you're going to miss a big part of chapter 2. Because Paul didn't have these chapter divisions in mind. And so when we jump into chapter 2, he's going to expect us to be very familiar with what he's said before. So, keep in mind chapter 1, and maybe tonight if you're coming for the first time and you haven't read chapter 1, go back and read it, and it'll help you with what I'm saying tonight. So let's get into the text. Verse 1 says, "But as for you, teach what accords with sound doctrine." Now remember what has just come before. Paul has just got done talking about these false teachers, these heretics who had come into the church. He'd said that they profess to know God. They deny them by their works. They're detestable, disobedient, unfit for any good works. And then he says, but. He's contrasting the way the church is supposed to be, the way Titus is supposed to be, in comparison with these false teachers. But as for you, teach what accords with sound doctrine. Now, sound doctrine. That's very important with what we're about to go and talk about here. Paul's about to go onto a list of some very practical things related to the different groups within the church. Old men, old women, younger women. And sometimes what we like to do is we'll read these things and there might be something in there that makes us a little uncomfortable. Paul might have said something that doesn't sit well with our 21st century Western American ideas. And so we'll say, well, that was just cultural. That was just meant for the first century church in Crete at that time, and it doesn't apply to us today. Well, we can't use that excuse for this, because Paul very clearly says that what he's about to say is rooted in sound doctrine. And sound doctrine is ageless. It wasn't just applicable for the first century church. It was applicable all the way through today and on into the future. So these things that we're about to talk about are just as applicable today as they were then. Paul says, older men are to be sober-minded, dignified, self-controlled, sound in faith, in love, and in steadfastness. Now this is interesting. You see Paul specifically talking about the roles that different groups are supposed to have in the church. Older men are to be sober-minded, dignified. These men are supposed to be the leaders of the church. They're supposed to be the sturdy oaks of sound doctrine. The older men in a church should be the ones that people look up to, not just because of their age and their wisdom in the world, but because of their wisdom and their growth in Scripture. The older folks in a church have had that much more time to grow in Scripture and to study Scripture. And Paul expects that these people would be the mature Christians, the ones who are leading the way theologically, the ones who can confront heresy when it crops up in the church. Remember we talked about last week how the pastor has to be able to confront heresy within the church. Well, Paul is telling us that that's not just for the pastor. You guys don't get off the hook in confronting heresy in your church and community. That applies to everyone, because the older men are supposed to be sound in doctrine. They're supposed to be sober-minded, dignified, self-controlled. And then he goes on, sound in faith, in love, and in steadfastness. Sturdy. The people that you can count on showing up and praying when the church needs prayer. The people you can count on being there through the storms of the church, who are not going to be blown away by every new idea or new fad. The people who are sturdy, who have deep roots. Paul goes on in verse 3, talking about older women. Older women likewise are to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers or slaves to much wine. They are to teach what is good. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this, but Paul keeps kind of referencing this wine thing. He talked about it in the qualifications for elders as well. He said that the elder is not to be a drunkard, the pastor is not to be a drunkard, and here he says that the older women are not to be slaves to much wine. And you might be wondering, why in the world does Paul keep going back to this? I mean, we talked about it last week. We said that as Southern Baptists we need to submit to the leadership of our church and be willing to put aside alcohol because that's the position of our church. But why does Paul specifically address this over and over and over again here? And the reason is because in Crete, in the first century, drunkenness was viewed as a virtue. It was a good thing to get drunk. They thought it brought you to some higher plane of consciousness, and so that's why Paul keeps pressing this over and over. And I mean, as I'm sure all of you know, getting drunk does not lead you to some higher plane of consciousness. It leads your car right into trees. So Paul says to these women who are living in this culture, and maybe there was a problem in the church with these women being drunkards. Paul thought it was a big enough issue to address here. And so while we may not have that problem, it's important to understand why he said that. And it's because in that culture, drunkenness was a virtue. As odd as that sounds, as crazy as that sounds, they thought going out and getting hammered was a good thing. He says they're to be reverent in behavior, not slanderers. I think that Paul had a good understanding of how men and women are wired differently. Guys, we're not as social. We tend to be a little more, independent. And we like to go out and talk to the guys, but, we like to do our own thing as well. And he knew that sometimes the women's prayer meeting could turn into a rumor mill. And so he says women are not to be slanderers. He recognizes that that was a problem. And so he says that they need to be lifting people up